I will be hosting the conversation this afternoon, where you'll be hearing from real experts in this field, our own academic colleagues and leading thinkers, and I will just hold the space of the conversation so that we really have a chance to grapple with the themes that we're going to be discussing today, which you'll hear more of shortly when I hand over to Professor Nitz Fitzpatrick. So from my side, just to give you a sense of how the afternoon is going to go, and also I should just say a really warm welcome to colleagues from TU Dublin, to colleagues from the European University, of course, and colleagues who are joining online. So we are also live streaming on YouTube, so hopefully we're joining in multiple formats to really have a way to bring everyone together in this conversation for those of us in person, the beautiful concert hall of TU Dublin Grange Gorman. So just a sense of what's going to happen during the afternoon. After Noel has opened, we're going to hear 3 key presentations, 3 provocations that are really going to get us thinking from different esteemed thinkers and speakers in this area, and we'll introduce them shortly. And then we're going to move into more of a panel conversation with many other colleagues who have got real contributions to bring in this area. And time allowing, I know we just had a little announcement about time, is trying to find a dance between hearing, taking in these ideas, and also space to maybe ask 1 or 2 questions or have a bit of a whole group conversation here in the room. That is our wish, to do whatever it takes to really start to connect on these ideas and to hear diverse perspectives in the room today. So, and just at the practical level, for the people that are physically in the room, in the event of a fire, God willing there won't be one, we have 4 fire exits. There are 2 down here and 2 up at the back of the room. So just use those to exit the building. So, yeah, I did feel a little bit like, I think I've been on too many Ryanair flights, so there we are. So with that, I think it's time for me to vacate the stage and hand over to Professor Nitz Fitzpatrick to open our think tank. Yeah.
So, good afternoon, everybody, and I'd like to welcome the cultural attaché from the Spanish Embassy, the ambassador from the Belgian Embassy, and the ambassador from the Cypriot Embassy, Cyprus as well. So we have put in place a European think tank which is called the EUt Ideas Institute. This came out of the work that we did in the first phase of the European University of Technology, where we began to ask questions about the relationship between technology and society. And then we got supplementary funding through a SWOFS project to develop a methodology around how we would organize a European think tank. And I would like to thank in particular Paul Hayes, who has worked on the methodology over the last 12 months in particular. And what we have had up to date is 2 think tanks in Riga in Latvia, 1 in Bulgaria in Sofia, which we're looking at questions of ethics and technology, in particular ethics and AI. And then today we're going to move to the question of European values. So the think tank has developed as a way to engage colleagues around key questions which underpin the European University of Technology, and that's why we have moved to the question of European values. But one thing I would just add before we start is that one of the questions that we're asking is the relationship between what we call technology and society. So we're trying to expand out what we mean by technology. So we could go back to the Greek origin of the term, which is techne, and techne includes all forms of techniques, mediation in the world, which includes the creative arts, the visual arts, and music, for example. So one of the things that has come to mind as we prepare for today, we have Professor Richard Kearney, who was my mentor in philosophy a long, long time ago, and he introduced me to the work of the French philosopher Jacques Derrida. And Jacques Derrida wrote a text, a speech he gave in 1998, which is called The University Without Conditions. And in that text, Derrida argues that the university is a place where we can ask questions without conditions. And I think that's part of our role within the European University of Technology, is to ask sometimes the awkward questions. So today, the question is not simply what are European values, but how do we implement them, or why are they not being implemented? The European Union promotes values including human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, rule of law, and human rights. Each of these values is highly aspirational and necessarily entails a process of appropriation and interpretation, both at an individual level and at a collective level. The European University of Technology has a responsibility to examine what these European values mean and how they are translated into action. It is useful as a group for us to step outside our values for a moment to determine more clearly what they are and how they have developed. This stepping outside is what we intend by deconstructing European values in order to better assert what they mean today as part of the European University of Technology. And I think it's fitting that we are in a concert hall here in TU Dublin, because one of the values is a value of speculation, of academic freedom. So in a space of speculation, we can therefore ask questions around an imaginary space, which is also European values. And I came across a very interesting quotation, which was from the 2002 European Theatre Festival, where the South African French dramatist Joseph Reynier gave a paper about the relationship between myths and models for future theatrical creation. He argued the myth of Europa was one of the most important in the classical world. Mentioned in passing by Homer, subject to Grecian vase paintings and the decoration in houses of Pompeii, immortalized by Ovid's Metamorphoses, painted in modern times by Rembrandt and Rubens, Europa was a princess from Phoenicia in now South Lebanon. A daughter of the king of the city of Tyre on the coast of Sidon. The story goes that she was seduced by the father of the god, Zeus, who had disguised himself as a white bull and then carried her off to Crete to bear their offspring on the continent that would now become known as Europe. The fact that an abducted Asian woman giving her name to Europe shows that what had been a divine appropriation and myth was transformed in history to a story of hatred between two continents. In terms of rethinking Europe as an unbounded space, it is important that contemporary playwrights exploit this collision of worlds by remembering, firstly, that Europe's origins are non-European, and secondly, despite Eurocentric efforts to the contrary, it is impossible to determine where Europe stops, where Asia and Africa begin. So I see that as a kind of a challenge which is posed to us when we ask the question about European values. Sometimes it's important to try and use the imaginary space to think through what these values are and how they can be implemented. So they're kind of the opening remarks for this afternoon, and we are now going to hand over to the first keynote, who is Hans Kundnani. So thank you. Yeah. We just.
The scene, yeah.
Okay, so Hans Kundnani has come to prominence over the last 2 years, 18 months or so.
In order for the concept to make sense, for there to be some meaningful European values, it seems to me that you'd have to identify some specific values which, on the one hand, unite Europeans. In other words, they're shared across Europe, and at the same time, be distinct from values held by people from other parts of the world. In other words, that set Europeans apart. It does seem to me that there are some, rather abstract, universal values that are broadly shared around the world. But as soon as you try to be more precise and identify distinctively European values, what I think often happens is that it turns out actually that the differences within Europe, that is between Europeans, become as apparent as the differences between Europe and the rest of the world. So let's take, one good example would be democracy, right, which is often on that list of things which we think of as being European values. Europeans sometimes talk about democracy as if they're the only ones in the world who believe in democracy, and obviously they're not. There's nothing distinctively, it seems to me, distinctively European about democracy. We could also get into a longer historical conversation about the origins of democracy. There is a tendency to imagine that Europeans invented democracy, but actually the history of this is quite complicated, as John Keane has shown, and so actually it's quite difficult, I think, even to claim that Europeans invented democracy. But certainly in the world today, they're not the only ones that believe in democracy, and so I think that it becomes quite difficult then to think of this as being something distinctively European. The second condition, it seems to me, for this idea of European values to be meaningful, in addition to a set of values that Europeans share and that set them apart from the rest of the world, it seems to me that Europeans must somehow be collectively committed to these values in a way that just goes beyond rhetoric. In other words, Europeans actually must live by these values rather than simply proclaiming them. We know that in the EU's founding treaty, it claims that it is, quote, founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, respect for human rights. But I don't think we can just sort of say that because that's in the EU treaties, that means that that's what Europe stands for. I think we have to interrogate how the EU actually promotes those values, both internally and externally. And in particular, this sort of raises the question around the role of the EU specifically in this idea of European values. Because it seems to me that when people talk about European values, they're often conflating two quite distinct things. The first is the one that I've already mentioned, which is a set of values that Europeans are claimed to collectively believe in. But the second thing, which is quite distinct, is a set of values that are embodied by the institutional structures and policies of the EU. In other words, EU values as opposed to European values in a more general sense. And it seems to me that it's far from obvious that those two things go together at all. There are some things which the EU stands for, it seems to me, but that's quite different from things which Europeans collectively believe in or promote or pursue. This brings me back to the second of the two quotes that I began with from Marquez from the S&D group in the European Parliament. When he says, the far right, their values are not European, I think what he's saying is that those values are not compatible with the EU. In other words, they're not pro-European. So he's specifically referring, I think, to the EU here. And the implication of this logic, and I think even stating it out loud, which obviously he doesn't do, but I think stating it out loud actually shows you how problematic this is. The implication of this logic is that the EU is European, and Euroscepticism is anti-European or non-European. So there's this kind of conflation or confusion between Europe, in quotes, and the EU itself. And I think that's really problematic. And so I think in a lot of the rhetoric around European values, there's this slippage going on between Europe as a whole and something specific around the EU. Now, I think the best example of this is democracy, which I've already critiqued in terms of it's not exclusively European. But I think the other problem with thinking about democracy as a European value is that precisely one of the main criticisms of the EU is that it's not democratic. Now, I don't want to get into a big, long debate about the right way to think about the EU in relation to democracy. Is it non-democratic? Is it anti-democratic? And so on. But I think the fact that this is at least problematic. I think we can agree that most EU member states are democracies, but the EU itself, its relationship with democracy is rather problematic. I always think of the quote by Ulrich Beck, the German sociologist, who was not at all a Eurosceptic, very much a pro-European, who said that if the EU were to apply to join the EU, it wouldn't be allowed to do so because it's not a democracy. So there's at least, I think, something problematic about the EU from a democratic perspective, which then I think makes it quite difficult to talk about democracy as a European value. The same thing I think we could apply to human rights, which is again often part of that list of European values. And here I think one just needs to look at EU policy in the Mediterranean, refugee policy, which I think some of the other speakers might come back to later on. 28,000 people have died in the Mediterranean since 2014 as a consequence of EU policy. And this is a policy in which the EU is striking deals with authoritarian regimes, which by the way links back to the question of democracy, and essentially outsourcing violence to these authoritarian regimes. Most recently Tunisia and so on. I think it then becomes quite difficult to claim that the EU stands for human rights, although that is obviously something that people claim all the time. But I think one has to sort of go beyond the rhetoric and look at how look at the actions of the EU as well as just its rhetoric. And that brings me finally to what I think I've talked a little bit about democracy and human rights, but I think the value which I think is the most plausibly thought of as being a European value in the way that I've described, distinctively European, shared by Europeans, and somehow embodied by the EU. I think the value that can be most plausibly claimed to be European in that sense is this idea of the rule of law. I think that's more plausible than democracy or human rights as a sort of core European value. After all, the EU is nothing but a set of rules. Creating rules is what the EU does. But it seems to me that even thinking of the rule of law as the sort of paradigmatic European value is problematic. And this is, I'll just make a few remarks about this and then finish. The first is that I think there's this tendency to sort of adopt a rather simplistic idea of the rule of law, as if the rule of law is just making rules. That's not quite what the rule of law is. And by the way, this gets quite complicated because this then comes, I think, back to questions around democracy. But if you arbitrarily make rules and enforce them, that's not quite the rule of law. The rule of law is a slightly distinct concept from that. But beyond that sort of conceptual question about exactly what the rule of law is, which I think people don't really sort of spend enough time sort of unpacking and thinking about carefully, I think we have to again interrogate to what extent the EU is actually upholding the rule of law both internally, in other words, within its borders, and externally beyond its borders. So if we start with the external case, I think one of the most most important threats to the rule of law internationally right now is, for example, China's acquisition and consolidation of territory in the East and South China Seas. There's been, for example, international tribunal rulings against China. But here, the EU, talks about principled neutrality, but is actually largely absent from trying to enforce the rule of law. And actually other states, including the United States, are actually actively trying to do that in much more, in a much stronger way than the EU does. We could talk about Gaza here as well. I think Lorna might talk a little bit about that next. But there I think the idea that the EU stands for the international rule of law, is in the last 6 months has started to look not very credible. Let me say. And then finally, if you think about this question of the rule of law internally, it's true that the EU sort of invokes this idea of European values to justify taking action against Poland and Hungary for violations of the domestic rule of law. The problem, though, and this comes back to what I said a minute ago about this distinction between, just setting rules and enforcing them and this concept of the rule of law. The problem is that the EU has used that same rhetoric around European values and rules to enforce, for example, the Eurozone's fiscal rules. I think that's somewhat discredited this idea of the rule of law. And then finally, and this brings me back to where I started in terms of thinking about a set of values that actually unites Europeans, which actually is, I think, more difficult to do than, it's more difficult to find that set of shared European values than it first seems, beyond these, very broad, abstract values. It turns out, actually, that, the rule of law is precisely one of the questions around which there's been a big fight within the EU over the last decade or so. So in other words, this concept of the rule of law doesn't seem actually to be something which unites Europeans, it actually divides them. So, the rule of law, and I think some of this goes for some of the other values, democracy and human rights that I discussed as well, it may be a value in which a lot of pro-Europeans believe, but that doesn't quite make it a distinctive European value. And like other things that we call European values, it doesn't necessarily mean that all Europeans support it. And so, I end with the question I began with, which is, does it really make sense to talk about these things as European values?
I'll just introduce Hans, thank you so much, and really for opening the conversation in such a direct way. I'm wondering if we should have called our think tank today "What EU Values," as you say, because it's a question, which is which, and really for bringing in this rule of law as something for us to question and to analyse. What we'll do is we'll hear from our next two speakers first, and then maybe take a couple of questions. And so just before inviting our next speaker up onto the stage, to just tell you a little bit about them. And Hans, if you could remain there ready for the further discussion after. Thank you so much. So our next speaker is Lorna Hayes, who is the Deputy CEO in Policy and Research with European Movement Ireland. And I know, Hans, you were mentioning that we're going to follow on into sort of hearing from you, Laura, and maybe look at some of the how this is playing out in different contexts. Because I know your background is really in human rights and development work with organisations like Tracare, Amnesty International, Frontline Defenders, and that's really looking at research and campaigning strategies and managing country programmes in Central America, Colombia, Myanmar. So places really where this work with human rights defenders and civil society networks was so completely essential. And I know your area is really around this kind of engagement and advocacy with policymakers at the government level and multilaterally. So Lorna, the stage is yours. Thanks so much for continuing the conversation for us.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lorna Hayes, and I'm delighted to be here this afternoon to talk to you all and discuss and debate the key values that underpin the European project. And as Ali mentioned, I work for European Movement Ireland. This year we're actually celebrating our 70th anniversary, which means we predate our membership of the EU. And in 1972, we were in fact the lead civil society organisation collaborating with the then Department of External Affairs to develop a Yes to Europe campaign. And since then, we've continued to develop the connection between Ireland and Europe through public engagement, communications and advocacy. But as Ali also mentioned, prior to joining EM Ireland, I worked for 20 years in human rights and international development, so with human rights defenders and their organizations in a range of countries and places, including Colombia, Central America, Myanmar, the occupied Palestinian territories, Sierra Leone, Zimbabwe, and elsewhere. I was also very lucky to spend several years as a researcher in refugee rights, so I spent a lot of time speaking to refugees around the world. And the refugees I met spoke of the lives they were forced to leave behind and the horrors that drove them, the massive risks they faced fleeing their countries, and their hope to eventually find a place of safety and dignity for themselves and their families. So my talk today, therefore, is very much shaped by my experience and witnessing the very real human impact on people outside of Europe when there's a value deficit in the EU. And it leads on very well from what Hans presented today and some of his questions around how does Europe in fact promote these values in practice. So as others have mentioned, the EU's founding values are the respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and the respect for human rights. Europe has a rich tapestry of frameworks and legal tools to uphold these core values, both within the region and, importantly, in its external action. The protection of human rights was codified in the European Convention on Human Rights in 1953, and alongside it, the European Court of Human Rights allows individuals to bring cases where they feel their convention rights have been breached. At EU level, the Charter of Fundamental Rights from 2009 onwards has contributed to the further evolution of human rights protections. So Europe clearly has a robust system to uphold its values, and it is taking great strides to ensure these values are translated and enforced in its regional and domestic laws. However, while the EU's institutions and legislation are central to safeguarding its values, only the lived experience and equal enjoyment of these values by citizens within and outside the region can be the ultimate arbiter of their success. Europe's core values should not be taken for granted. While threats to European values are often perceived to be external or perhaps coming from the far right within Europe, harms to democracy and human rights that result from the EU's own practices and omissions tend to be overlooked. Today, my talk is going to focus on two key issues: the EU's response to people on the move, so by that I mean refugees and migrants, as well as its response to the current situation or conflict in Israel and Gaza. These are defining issues of our time, and both require responses rooted in our common humanity and ones that elevate our values of human dignity and the universality of human rights over any other concerns. As others have mentioned, the EU's policy making in the area of migration and asylum in recent years has increasingly diverged from its values of human dignity and respect for human rights and its commitment to strictly observe international law. For years, the EU has sought to externalise its border control, in essence outsourcing migration management to countries on the EU's external borders or third countries in neighbouring regions, in an attempt to reduce arrivals to Europe and onwards movement within the bloc. Striking deals with third countries with poor human rights records to curb migration has profound implications for people seeking safety and survival, and it risks the EU's complicity in human rights violations. Since 2016, as the EU agreements or MOUs with third countries have accelerated, so too has the subordination of the EU's human rights obligations towards refugees and migrants. In this period, the EU and member states have pursued agreements with a range of countries, including Turkey, Libya, Tunisia, and Egypt. In 2016, the EU started assisting the Libyan Coast Guard, and further cooperation was then formalised between the EU and Libya and Italy and Libya in 2017. As part of these agreements, the EU has provided Libya with support, including training, equipment, and vessels to deter and intercept people attempting to depart from Libya. Amnesty International and other organisations have documented widespread abuses committed against migrants and refugees who were intercepted and pulled back to Libya. including torture, rape and sexual abuse, extrajudicial killings, forced labour and arbitrary detention. The practice of outsourcing the EU's responsibilities has in turn deflected focus away from the creation of viable, safe and legal routes to Europe. One such route is resettlement. Refugee resettlement programmes enable refugees in host countries to be resettled in a third safe country where they can access adequate protection. For example, refugees who have initially fled to major host countries in their immediate region, countries such as Lebanon, Jordan, Kenya and Pakistan and elsewhere, where they've been unable to find a durable solution, in part because these countries are already hosting large numbers of refugees. Between 2019 and 2024, the number of people in need of resettlement increased from 1.4 million to 2.4 million worldwide. But during the same period, the EU's resettlement pledges have halved. The failure to provide resettlement or other safe pathways continues to push people into embarking on perilous journeys across the Mediterranean and other dangerous routes, and it has led to the deaths of thousands of refugees and migrants attempting to reach Europe. In what has sometimes been described as a race to the bottom, the EU's response to people on the move has tarnished its reputation as a region that upholds dignity, equality and human rights. Its response has all too often been characterised by a vacuum of solidarity with major host countries, both within and beyond Europe. The EU Commissioner for Human Rights in her 2023 report denounced ongoing pushbacks, inadequate responses to tragedies at sea, inhumane reception conditions and restrictive family reunification, practices that are not compatible with the EU's values or its obligations under international law. The recently agreed EU Pact on Migration and Asylum, which I think in fact could be voted on today, looks set to further expand on and formalise some of these practices. Meanwhile, humanitarian workers and refugee rights defenders in the EU, ordinary citizens who sought to protect and assist refugees and migrants, have increasingly been criminalised for their solidarity in some countries. In some places, people providing humanitarian assistance, legal advice, or involved in rescue missions or border monitoring and media reporting have faced harassment, arrest and detention, and stigmatisation. Notwithstanding the EU's troubling record in this regard, citizens around Europe have repeatedly stood up in support of and to welcome refugees. During some of the worst years of the Syrian crisis, community groups across Europe self-organised to welcome Syrian refugees as part of official community sponsorship schemes. Similar schemes were then later replicated to receive people fleeing Russia's atrocities in Ukraine. What is more, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and how the EU responded has shown us that Europe can mobilise and show solidarity consistent with its values. For instance, when the EU activated the Temporary Protection Scheme for Ukrainian refugees, it demonstrated that it can receive refugees in a dignified and coordinated manner and offer international protection, where the political will to do so exists. Europe's response, or the EU's response to people on the move, should not be dictated by nationality, race, or religion, but rather by the EU's values and international human rights standards. It would be difficult to speak about European values today and not refer to the current situation in Israel and Gaza. In the months that have followed Hamas's brutal attack and killings of 1,200 Israelis on 7th of October, the EU's failure to form a coherent and rights-based response to Israel's assault on Gaza cannot be described as anything other than a manifest failure to uphold the most fundamental of European values, those of human rights, human dignity, and rule of law. In the face of unimaginable horrors being inflicted upon Palestinians who've endured 6 months of collective punishment by Israeli military forces, the destruction of their neighbourhood schools, universities, and hospitals, forced displacement, and more recently mass starvation and famine, the EU has faltered. Only on 21st of March, 6 months into Israel's siege and bombardment of Gaza, and after the loss of life of over 30,000 Palestinians, did the EU finally agree to call for a ceasefire. This is also despite the fact that in January of this year, the International Court of Justice, in its interim ruling, found plausible conditions for genocide in Gaza, a decision that obliges all states to take measures to prevent the crime of genocide against Palestinians. The EU's response has been marred by fractures at leadership level, reflecting some of the deeper challenges in the areas of common foreign policy making. At times of gross violations of human rights and loss of life, it's imperative that the bloc can consistently rise to the challenge, find ways to build consensus and ensure that its commitment to universal human rights and rule of law are not subordinated to other goals. It must be noted, however, that a minority of EU member states since the outset have persistently called for a ceasefire, the release of hostages, and for all parties to abide by international human rights and humanitarian law. While also condemning Hamas's atrocities, countries like Ireland, Belgium, and Spain have pursued bilateral actions in an effort to push for Israel's compliance with international law. However, the EU as a bloc, Israel's most important trading partner, and accounting for 28.8% of Israel's trade in goods in 2022, has chosen not to use the tools at its disposal to leverage pressure on Israel to halt the horrific killings of women, men, and children. Observers have also commented on the apparent double standards between the EU's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, when it condemned Russia's violations of human rights and international humanitarian law, and took swift steps to sanction Russia. In contrast, in the face of widespread evidence of atrocity crimes by Israel, the EU's response has been muted. Against this backdrop, the EU's failure to respond has only served to diminish its moral authority with governments and civil society in the Middle East and elsewhere in the global South, while also calling into question its commitment to the universality of human rights and to hold to account those who flaunt them. What is also remarkable has been the chasm between the muted position of the EU in contrast to broad sectors of its citizens. Since October the 7th, in inspiring acts of solidarity, European citizens in their thousands have come out to the streets, while also calling into question its commitment to the universality of their thousands have come out to the streets week after week, demanding a ceasefire, and have continued to show up in support of the Palestinian people. Finally, as I conclude my talk, I want to briefly mention the growth of the far right in the EU. As the European Parliament elections loom, the expansion of the far right also poses significant challenges to the centrality of European values in EU politics and affairs. Fear-based populist discourse, which appeals to citizens' insecurities, is a common tool of far-right actors. As they label and blame the other, they tap into people's concerns around daily life, be it the cost of living, unemployment, the economic impact of the war in Ukraine, or crime and insecurity. This form of politics offers no real solutions, however. Rather, it seeks to scapegoat and demonize the most marginalized and at risk in our societies. In this context, mainstream political actors should seek to develop alternative narratives and agendas, ones that are proudly rooted in European values and that endorse equality, inclusion, and diversity. In this way, we can start to reimagine European politics based on our shared values and common humanity. Thank you very much.
Lorna, thank you so much. I was just thinking, I was sort of hearing in that there are values, there's values that you're speaking to that should be upheld, but you're really illuminating for us the, like kind of underneath, there's a complicity in the EU at least to real violations, horrendous violations. And so that mismatch, like what are we going to do about that? And then coming to the rise of very different voices in these times. So I hope this has definitely provoking us to think. I can hear a little bit of bubbling and conversation things happening. Just, you know, that's the purpose of this. We may not agree with it all, but we have to grapple with it. So inviting you to keep bringing your minds and hearts to this. So with that, we're going to move on to our third of our kind of key opening presentations. And I will just introduce our third speaker. And Noel's already mentioned, obviously, Noel will know you well, Richard, but I'll just kind of give a bit more of the formal bio as well for those of us that don't know you. So our third speaker is Richard Kearney. Okay, Richard is there, I know, and will appear shortly. Great. Yeah, Richard, just nice. We can see you now. I knew you were there, but it was nice to get to see you. So, Richard, yeah, just to say that I know you hold the Charles Seelig Chair in Philosophy at Boston College. You have taught in Dublin at UCD and the University of Paris. You're the author of many books but in the area of European philosophy, literature and culture. And just to name a few of Richard's books, we've got Modern Movements in European Philosophy, The Wake of Imagination, and Migrations, the Irish at Home and Abroad, and Post-Nationalist Ireland. Not only books expressing your thinking, but also poetry, novels, latest novels, Salvage, and also the founder and director of a project, which sounds a really beautiful name and vision, the Guest Book Project, which is an international non-profit committed to a culture of narrative hospitality. So in that vein, Richard, thank you so much for sharing your remarks with us today.
Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be with you. I'm sorry I'm not with you in person, but it's good to talk digitally, and this is part of our new technology which can allow for such exchanges from a distance. So I would actually like to talk this morning about the value of narrative hospitality as a European value, and particularly as it relates to the question of migration, or what I call the migratory imagination. I'll be taking a somewhat cultural approach to this, cultural literary, more than political or legal. So in that sense, maybe my talk will somewhat supplement and complement what has already been said by the previous speakers. And I'll be talking about a cultural imaginary of migration. Keeping in mind Jean Monnet's famous remark, "L'Europe sera culturelle ou elle ne sera pas." Europe will be cultural or it will not be. And I do think that the cultural needs to supplement the political and the social and the economic as we debate issues of European values. So what I want to begin with is some words, some analysis of the migratory memory of Europe. And indeed, I will begin of Ireland, with Ireland in particular. My mentor, Paul Ricoeur, used to always say, when he would open a seminar, "D'où parlez-vous?" Where do you speak from? So I will begin, at any rate, by speaking from a somewhat Irish perspective, and raise the question of the migratory imagination and the value of narrative hospitality, which I believe it entails, in the context of our contemporary experience of emigration and immigration, which is one of the great problems, questions, challenges of contemporary Europe. I would add of the contemporary world, but let's focus on Europe for now. And while the experience of immigration is usually dealt with in terms of a linear model of emigration and immigration in and out of a particular nation or nation state. I want to talk about migration in terms of an ana-migration, using the prefix of the Greek term, but also available in English, of course, anamnesis, to remember, analogy, to think of one thing in terms of another. The term ana in the Oxford English Dictionary means back, forth, up, again in space and time. But it's a very, very beautiful word in that, related to migration, ana-migration is a circular model rather than a linear model of strangers arriving or natives leaving, which very often sets up a binary opposition whereas the animigration model is much more one of reiteration, circulation, transmigration, so to speak. And I want to begin, as I said I would, with an Irish example. Going back to our cultural memory, we have some of the earliest texts available to us in the Irish language, and indeed in the Latin language, dating back to 8th, 9th, 10th centuries. They're called imam. And the imam was a genre of migration. It was a mythic story of voyaging, where the protagonist, Brendan, Bran, Maeldoon, would set off on a journey, which was translated into Latin. The imam, the Celtic word imam, becomes circumnavigatio. It's translated as circumnavigatio. It's a journey around. And so these protagonists would set off in order to be fully alive, in order to be fully human. They would set off on this journey of peregrination or circumnavigation. And there could be a white or a green navigatio. If it was green, they landed back where they started from, having traversed what were called the Blessed Isles, the Foreign Isles, the Wandering Isles. They would return to where they started from, or they would land somewhere else and find home there. And most of these journeys were westwards. But if it was a white migration, they disappeared into the waves. So there was always a sense that there was a risk, there was a wager in setting out on this journey. But one's identity as a Celt, a Scotus, as they were called in those days, which included actually most of the inhabitants of the British Isles, of Britain and Ireland, to be a Scotus, it entailed this notion of journeying. We know from Aristotle that at a natural level, as well as a cultural level, journeying is extremely important. He says, Aristotle, in the physics and the metaphysics, that movement is central to the human being and the flourishing of human life, movement, and that the least lively creature, poor thing, is the oyster, because its invertebrate and immobile nature means that it never lives fully. So movement, mobility, migration were seen in many of the founding myths and mythic stories of many cultures. This is true of the Nordic cultures also. You only have to look at the Viking sagas. This was absolutely central. It was central to the biblical myths. What is the founding story of biblical Abrahamic revelation and ethics? It is the three wandering strangers appearing in Genesis to Abraham and Sarah and being revealed through the sharing of food as divine. The Ish, as they were called in Hebrew, the Ger. And in the Greek culture, one of the earliest Greek myths, you have Zeus and Hermes appearing as wandering strangers to Baucis and Philemon, and again being revealed as divine through the sharing of food. Homer indeed has Odysseus returning to Ithaca after his odyssey and circumnavigation as what? As a xenos, as a disguised wandering stranger. So it is not unique to our Celtic cultural imaginary to praise and celebrate this notion of the wanderer, the migrant. And it's very interesting that in our contemporary literature and cinema, wandering to islands and island literature has come back again very much to the fore. We had the Banshees of Inisheer shot on the western islands of Inishmore and the Blasket. We have Emma Donoghue's novel, Kevin Barry's novel, set again on islands with the notion of voyaging. But the voyaging as a cultural memory was not just westwards to the Blessed Isles, to High Brazil, the circumnavigatio, it also went eastwards. And we have a very important circumnavigation also in the persons of Columbanus, Gallus, Duns Scotus, others who went eastwards and southwards. In the case of Columbanus and Gallus, they went through Great Britain into Belgium, France, Obviously, it wasn't, these were regions in those days, small fiefdoms and so on. It was, you know, just before or during Charlemagne in his attempt to bring France together. But they traveled through there and founded various settlements and monasteries and libraries. They went to Gallen in Switzerland, Germany, down into Italy. And so it was inscribed in the notion of even holiness that one wandered, one migrated. This was absolutely central. And this involved a dialectic of home and homeless, not homelessness, home and not being at home, which again is fundamental to the human psyche. If Aristotle talked about movement and wandering as central to human biology and physics, and indeed metaphysics, Freud and Heidegger, for example, in the 20th century have come back to this dialectic of the Heimlich and the Unheimlich, of home being also in relation to not being at home, of being here and elsewhere. So this double belonging, as it were, can be seen as a value, as a virtue. I'm saying that not at all to in any way ignore or neglect the tragedy, the pain, the suffering of so much contemporary immigration and emigration, which has been very often involuntary, forced upon people by virtue of violence, invasion, poverty, climate crisis. Absolutely, this is not an attempt to romanticize or sentimentalize or in any way whitewash or wish away the tragedy, the challenge of migration, but it is to also see the possibility of a value in a social imaginary that is not a dystopia. And of course, much of the writing and thinking about immigration at the moment, and for good reason, is dystopian. And it's not to escape into a utopia, it is to embrace what I would call an anatopia. It's another way of thinking again about migration as having a value, a respect, a dignity, as well as, of course, the mark of woundedness, trauma, and suffering. So in my final remarks, I would like to move from this kind of cultural memory of the migrant imagination as an act of hospitality where you receive migrants into your cultures, as the Celtic, the Biblical, the Hellenic, the Nordic. One could extend the frontiers almost indefinitely. You will find it at the heart of almost all cultures. The stranger in all Indo-European languages, for example, has a double sense of being a friend and an enemy. It can appear, the migrant appearing out of the desert to Abraham, out of the night to Baucis and Philemon, whatever, can appear first as an enemy, an adversary, even a monster. But the word xenos, the word in Latin, étranger, and so on, hospes, hostis, carries this sense of hostility, but also hospitality, that the wanderer, the migrant, can be either an enemy or a friend. And that's always a wager. So it's a drama. It's a risk, but it's something, a challenge that we need to embrace, and perhaps nowhere and at no time more than at the moment in Europe. So I want to end with some remarks on narrative hospitality as an exchanging of stories and history. And I take my tune here from, again, Paul Ricoeur in an essay, Towards a New Ethos for Europe, where he talks about an ethos of Europe based on the value of exchanging memories. Memories of woundedness as well as memories of glory and triumph. And very often the memory of one nation's triumph and glory is that of another nation's defeat. Even in my own native Ireland, the Battle of the Boyne for one people, Irish Nationalist, Republican, whatever, Catholic, can be seen as a story of defeat. Whereas for the Protestant Unionist British community, loyalist community, it's seen as a story of glory and victory. So the exchange of memories where we become the other, so to speak, we empathize with the story of the other, can actually change history. And in the Guestbook project, which I founded and direct since 2009, it is predicated upon this idea of exchanging stories, changing histories. And in, again, most languages, or in many European languages, the word for history and story is the same. Geschichte in German, histoire in French, raconte-moi des histoires, ou je vais enseigner l'histoire. It can have this double sense of both story and history. So the exchange of stories can actually come from history, open up history to narrative hospitality, where there is an element of flexibility and attention to a certain particularity of the story that is very often ignored in official history. One of the virtues of poetics and an exchange of stories is precisely that it enables us to get to intimacies and forgotten voices and particularities and idiosyncrasies and singularities that are very often generalized and forgotten in official history. So in this essay towards a new ethos for Europe, Ricoeur calls for a catharsis through empathy and imagination by virtue of this exchange of stories, which allows for an exchange of histories. And this opens us to the possibility of transforming the past, which otherwise can repeat itself endlessly, the return of the repressed, as a compulsive reiteration of wounds, of traumas. The word trauma means wound in Greek. And so this can be opened up into a plurality of interpretations, because every story allows for a plurality of interpretations. History, unless translated into story, can very often get locked into an idée fixe, an official version. And so story enables us to realize that history can only be revisited properly through a plurality of narratives that gives and can give a future to the past, and very often to potential memories, neglected memories, that have never had the opportunity to be expressed and exchanged with one's adversaries. So we're back to anamnesis again. We're back to anamigration, this circulation of memories. And I'll just end with one or two examples of this as we try to explore it in Guestbook, because I see my 20 minutes is coming up shortly. Here in the project of digital storytelling, we work with young people in divided communities throughout the world, but just focusing on Europe because of the subject here today. We invited, for example, young people in Serbia and Croatia to tell their respective stories to each other and then to come up with a third. We did the same with Turks and Armenians, or with the British and Irish in Northern Ireland, the two separate communities separated by the wall of Derry. Those on the outside, on the bog side, have one view of the walls. Those on the inside, the loyalists, the Protestants, have another view of the walls. So they tell their respective story, and then they engage in the creation, through imagination, of a third story. And it's very interesting how, in several cases, they make videos together, and these are posted on the site, and then they're downloaded and discussed by different young people in community groups, peace groups, schools. Indeed, the two young women who created the third story in a video in Northern Ireland called A Piece Apart, ended their video by saying that every child in Northern Ireland, where education is still denominationally divided up to 80%, should always sit down when they have their first day in school with somebody from the opposite religion, from the other side of the wall. And they became peace ambassadors, wandering to different schools in Northern Ireland and indeed Southern Ireland. So a digital exchange of stories where they very clearly state at the beginning their history, why they believe the wall is, protecting them or is demonizing them, keeping them out or protecting them from within. Starting with that, acknowledging the differences through an exchange of histories, they then open that up to the creation of a third story, which is very often a project for the future. And that has, in several instances, and it's all very small scale, lowercase, led to little changes at the level of history. So exchanging stories can lead to an exchange of histories. And that itself is an example in digital technology, digital storytelling, of a migratory imagination. If I had time, I would have talked about translation as linguistic hospitality, and the guest language and the host language, which of course is so central to Europe, and the languages of Europe and the minority languages of Europe, lesser used languages, regional languages, as well as of course national languages. There isn't time for that, but that too is an example, as is the Erasmus system of exchanging students, another example of how the migratory imagination might be recalled as a fundamental memory and myth from our cultural imaginaries, and leading ultimately, as Seamus Heaney argues, to peace. For the end of art is peace. Thank you.
Wonderful, Richard. Thank you so much. This and ending on that, the plurality that stories actually hold, you know, is a real opening for us in this project. I think what we're contemplating, and also the idea of that journeying can be, that in itself has multiple. It's not only connected to trauma. There's also can be it's a deep root in us as human beings. So what I would like to do now is just, we'll see what we can do in the time. We want to have space to be able to go into some of these concepts and what's being shared, and then also to go into a more reflective conversation, really led by our panel, but hopefully with a bit of time from all of us gathered here as well. So we'll try this. It was just an invitation that if anyone has a kind of particular question, almost like a question for clarification, so it's not so much to give a big perspective of your own, but just if there's anything shared by Hans, Lorna, or Richard in these opening inputs that you'd like to just kind of get clear on, that's going to inform our later conversation, please raise a hand or put it onto the YouTube live stream now, and we'll just take maybe two or three questions if there are any, and if not, we'll move into the panel and kind of enrich it that way, and we can have a longer discussion. So anything, Eamon, we might, if we could have Richard and Hans just up on the screen, if possible, if we're going to do this, and I'll invite Lorna up as well. How do you feel? Anything burning that's more at this level of kind of something that didn't quite make sense, or you'd like to understand more, that would inform our later conversations? I will look at our YouTube. I'll just say YouTube's working and people are there, so hello to all of you. Okay, yeah. Okay, so I will say what's there on the YouTube, because we have one there. And Eamon, is it possible to have both Hans and Richard side by side? If not, don't worry. So we have one question coming up from our wider group, so those of us joining us online, saying, could you say a little more about, or could any of our speakers say a little bit more about EU versus Europe? Maybe that's quite broad. Hans, do you want to say something on that?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot that one could say there. I guess, so, you know, I think from my perspective, and I sort of alluded to this a little bit, what tends to happen, I think, is that Europe, in quotes, tends to be sort of deployed as a synonym for the EU. So if you take, for example, you know, President Macron, you know, when he talks about Europe, he often means the EU. Now, obviously, Europe and the EU are not the same. There's the obvious fact that not all European countries are part of the EU, so there isn't a perfect sort of fit between the EU as a collection of countries and Europe. Having said all of that, as was said in the introductory remarks at the beginning, I mean, in a way, there is a lack of clarity about where Europe ends anyway as a continent, or by the way, whether it is even a continent, right? I mean, it's not, you know, some people would argue that actually Europe shouldn't be a continent, isn't actually really a clearly defined continent. But on top of that sort of lack of sort of a perfect fit between the countries in Europe and the countries that are in the EU, there is also this problem that, you know, even for the countries like Ireland that are in the EU, there is a distinction between the EU defined as a collectivity of 27 member states and the EU defined as the EU institutions. So I think that what tends to happen quite a lot is that people use that lack of clarity for their own purposes. And very simply, I think roughly what happens is that pro-Europeans, that is supporters of the EU, will tend to essentially blame the member states for everything that's wrong with the EU, and sort of as a way of kind of slightly refusing to think critically about the EU institutions themselves and their role. And then conversely, I think what Eurosceptics will do will be to blame the EU for things which actually the EU member states are responsible for. But it all comes from this sort of confusion between Europe on the one hand and the EU on the other. I hope that helps to clarify.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it's a big theme. It really came alive when you first presented. I'm sure we could spend a whole day think tank just on that or more. But yeah, it's an important one to. It seems to be a key area that in our explorations today. Lorna, do you want to?
Sorry, can I just add one more sort of thing? So I think as far as this discussion on European values goes, the crucial thing is to distinguish between values which are embodied by the EU itself and values which Europeans collectively believe that they stand for. Those are two quite separate kind of things.
Yeah, thank you. Lorna, do you want to say anything on that? No. Okay.
Yeah. Really well.
I just honouring that it kind of that duality or and conflicting duality in a way seemed to be coming out in what you were saying too. Anything else? Any other?
Could I say a quick word?
Richard. Is that Richard?
No, that. Just very briefly, to come back to my hobby horse, the islands, and offshore islands and off-continental islands. I mean, Hans used the phrase, is Europe confined to the continent of Europe? Well, we're not. Where Hans comes from and I come from, we are and we're not as islands, the islands of Britain and Ireland. We're not part of the continent of Europe, and yet we're part of Europe. Now, I know that's geographical, but it's very important in terms of the geographical imaginary, because islands are places that belong and don't belong to the mainland, so to speak. And I talked about how that feeds into the Irish literary imagination and mythic imagination. But it's true of many, many islands where there's a sense that you can think outside of the box. When MacDonagh made Banshees of Inisherin, he's trying to think the Civil War outside of the box. In other words, the war that's happening on the mainland is being replicated in an experimental fashion on this island, off the island, which is off another island called Britain, which is off the continent. And there's just something about the discrepancy between Europe and the European Union which can be thought of positively, that there's a marginal, liminal area where it belongs and it doesn't belong. Cyprus is an island which is half Greek and half Turkish. So it's EU and it's not EU. And very often it's on islands that experiments about the values, in this instance of Europe, can actually be deplored and explored. I think, for example, of the idea of the Council of Isles, the British and Irish Council of Isles as an archipelago. That led to a lot of interesting thinking about joint and pooled sovereignty. The Nordic Council, which includes the Åland Islands and the Spitsbergen Islands. That was very important in terms of resolving by going beyond territorial sovereignty disputes. So you got a united Ireland, you got a united kingdom, 2 into 1 won't go in terms of sovereignty claims, literal constitutional sovereignty claims, because sovereignty is, as Rousseau and Baudin and others declared, one and indivisible. But suddenly you go to islands and it all becomes more porous. And I think, therefore, that gap between the EU and Europe as a porous liminal area, sort of a no man's land, is potentially a fertile one for rethinking notions of Europeanness.
Thank you, Richard. And I mean, I know growing up in Britain, Scotland and England, definitely feeling a distinction between mainland Europe and wider Europe, which of course we saw play out in the departure from the European Union.
Can I add one more thing? Sorry to come back again. I can't, since Richard has talked about islands and the sort of...
Oh, I think... Yeah, Hans, we just lost you for a moment.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, yeah.
I just wanted to add 2 sentences to what Richard said. So since he's talking about the periphery of Europe and islands, you know, there is also a further periphery, which is, some of which is also consists of islands, which is territories. Let's take, for example, French and Dutch territories in the Caribbean, which are part of the EU, not just part of the EU, part of the Eurozone. You know, where in Martinique and Guadeloupe, which are Département France, or in the Dutch territories, the Dutch Antilles, you pay in euros. So, you know, that also, I think, you know, it sort of takes further your point, Richard, about these liminal kind of spaces. And I think that the idea that there's a positive potential there is fascinating. But it sort of raises this question, you know, Guadeloupe and Martinique, are they Europe? I mean, in one sense, absolutely yes. In another sense, clearly no.
Yeah. Thank you, Hans. And just noting that in the room, even with these comments that are being made, I can see this kind of questioning of, yes, well, are we in or are we not? Are we at the edge or not? And I've seen different reactions coming up in the room. So maybe, Abdeltif, do you want to say your... So it'll be the last one we'll do for now, and then we'll take more discussion after.
Thank you very much. I just have one question on the... I think there's no better way to question what are the European values than looking at the EU values and then what is the EU-Europe. Of course, it's evident. The EU is not Europe. It's an organization in Europe. Europe could be also other things. Maybe better, maybe worse, I don't know. I love the EU. So that's the first thing to say. But I just have one question. So when the EU started, it was with, of course, not with Erasmus or all these values, but it was with the European coal and steel community. So it's really nothing about values. And then I look, for example, at what's going on in the world now, and you have, for example, a genocide. And some of the countries in Europe that have a very dark history are positively supporting this genocide. Again, after about 50 years, positively supporting one. So my question is it because the European Union started as, and this is maybe a populist question, but it's really the good thing about it is that it's very simple. Is it because the European Union started only as a community for economic reasons that the European Union will always give us only values that we like because they have a monetary value? So, and the good example, and this is my last sentence, is, for example, the war in Ukraine. Of course, what's happening in Ukraine is a crime. No country should be invaded in such a way, and the European Union says, that's not good, let's stop it. Because, of course, that smells like a lot of money and opposition to Russia, so it's really, you know. But when we look, for example, at what's going in Gaza, and that's it's a 35,000 people killed. It's not a joke. And the European Union acts, I'm sorry to say this, like I can't use the word, but like pure Nazis, like really. And we say nothing about what's going on there, and we act like if really it's okay that it happens. And the European politicians are saying nothing. Even, for example, if many European countries now are led by green and socialist parties, I don't want to name them. You know, it's a big elephant in the room. We have a big room, so let's talk about that elephant. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Abdeltif, for bringing that in. That's the last question we'll just take in this moment. Thanks a lot to our mic runners, but we'll be doing more shortly. So important to have said that. What I heard you saying at the end is this huge atrocities happening, and the European Union is doing nothing. Yeah. Okay, no, that's fine. We won't say more, just to take awareness of time. Just to say, I couldn't hear very well, I think just because of this beautiful big concert hall. I don't know if you heard, Lorna, but I'm just going to also restate, because you put it in the written notes as well, but basically maybe in essence the question in that, as well as your strong statement, Abdelatif, that I resonate with very much, is the purely economic origin of the EU having an impact on its ethical decisions, you know, and seeming to be only financially orientated? So I think that was in the crux of your question. So could I turn to you first, Lorna? Is there, and oh, you've got one.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that sounds okay. Yeah, no, thank you so much for your comments and questions, and I agree, and I think you're right. I mean, the origins of the EU was an economic project, and I think we can see today, when faced with some geopolitical crises, it doesn't have yet the systems in place to, or there are challenges around common foreign policy making, because that's still under the remit of individual member states. So you can see now, when faced with the immensity of what's happening in Gaza, they have been challenged in coming together and forming a coherent response. But I think, and linked to the previous question, I think it's interesting that that is a massive failure at EU level, but at least you can see that individual states can and do try and separately pursue other means. Like I mentioned, Ireland, Spain, Belgium, and the actions that they have taken and continue to take, and some of them are now trying to propose that Palestine will be recognised as a state. Ireland has submitted information to The Hague, to the ICG as well, on the genocide investigation. So individual countries are doing things. And I think it's very interesting, because in this case it's the EU, at EU level, that is failing in terms of a common response. And like I did mention tools that they have, which is they are the biggest trading partner. So they could potentially suspend the trade agreement. They could use sanctions. They could also push member states to stop providing arms, for example. But then there's other examples where the EU in a way has done better than some of the member states. So just after October, I think there was an initial move to suspend funding to Palestinian human rights organizations. And different countries wanted to investigate where that funding was going, as did the EU. And this has happened prior to this crisis, and it has some links to the misapplication of counter-terrorism frameworks against civil society. But in any case, the EU then didn't suspend and continued, or suspended briefly and then resumed funding to Palestinian NGOs, whereas certain individual countries maintained their suspension. And then the same has happened more recently with UNRWA, which is the only UN agency has the mandate to protect Palestinian refugees, Palestinians in Gaza and elsewhere in the region. And again, there were accusations of members being involved in the attacks on October the 7th. And different countries in Europe moved to cut all funding. The funding to UNRWA is essential, as we all know, and now more so than ever, given the scale of the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. And again, but in this case, again, the EU, I don't know if they suspended briefly, but they've continued funding UNRWA, whereas some of the countries, Ireland has continued funding UNRWA, but some of the other countries have refused or have suspended. So sometimes it's the EU actually has a more positive response than individual countries, and sometimes it's the other way around. But it's, you made a very good point, and I think it's something that what we've discussed today has really come to the fore. Like, this is a massive challenge at EU level.
Thank you so much. So, Hans or Richard, anything burning to add to that? I'd like to bring this session to a close fairly soon, because we have our panel members and we're really going to continue to respond to what we've been hearing. But was there anything burning to add there?
I'd love to add something if there's time.
Please do, yeah. So,
this is a fascinating question, and it opens up a lot of, I think, bigger questions, actually. I don't disagree with anything Lorna said, but I think I'd probably draw a slightly different conclusion, or maybe I'm starting from a different place, actually, around this question of, you know, when you look at what Lorna described, right? In particular, you know, this contrast between the refugee response on Ukraine on the one hand, and, you know, basically Africa on the other hand. And then when you look at the Gaza-Israel question, I think there are two ways of looking at this. One is, oh, well, the EU is diverging from the things that it stands for, which I think is how Lorna is describing it. And whereas I think my approach is like, well, I think then we need to question whether the EU does actually really stand for these things. And this then brings us back to this, the question which the questioner raised about the history of the EU. Because I think we need to distinguish quite clearly between, try to distinguish between myths about the history of the EU and the real history of the EU. A lot of, I think, what we all thought about the history of the EU is actually, you know, myths that have been created by the EU itself. So if we go back to the coal and steel community, which the questioner asked about, that is the beginning of the EU as a sort of peace project, right, to make war between France and Germany impossible. This is the story that the EU tells about itself. But it's quite striking that, you know, at the time when the coal and steel community is formed in 1950, France is fighting a brutal colonial war in Indochina. And then 7 years later, when the Treaty of Rome is signed, France is fighting a brutal colonial war in Algeria. And what I think that illustrates is that actually the EU as a peace project, you know, it was a very limited peace project. It was the idea that European countries shouldn't fight wars with each other. What Europeans didn't do, although they sort of imagine retrospectively that they did, is to reject war in general. So I think you can think of this as a kind of, I mean, this takes me to the subject of my book, but you can think of this as a sort of white peace, right? It's a peace project between white countries, but European countries weren't rejecting war beyond Europe at all. And so if we then come to the present day, and you look at, as I say, the contrast between the treatment of white and non-white refugees, or what's happening in Gaza, you know, that doesn't then anymore feel like a sort of aberration from things which the EU stood for, but it's actually in a long history of, it fits into a long history of the EU as a kind of a racialized project. And that then finally, you know, as I say, I think it sort of gets to this quite fundamental question that, you know, we're talking about today, which is how should we think about the values that the EU stands for? Is it that, you know, the EU proclaims certain values in the treaties, and then we accept that that's what the EU stands for, and then when it diverges from those, we say, well, it's diverging from the values which it stands for? Or do we think more critically, as I say, about the past and the present of the EU, and say, well, it's not clear actually the EU ever stood for these things?
Thank you. Definitely opening things up with this. Maybe just as we're coming to an end of the opening presentations, Richard, do you have a final remark just on this theme, just to sort of hear your voice as we close this section?
No, just maybe to add one thing, because I actually have to go and teach, so I won't be able to join you for the next part. But I would just like to say one thing about Gaza, which was raised, I think, by Hans at the beginning and by both speakers, but because, well, you know, we've been talking largely about Europe, but I think the exchange of stories that I was talking about between European nations in conflict, in terms of the Guestbook project, we've also worked with Gaza, sorry, not with Gaza, with Palestinians and Israelis, inviting them to tell their different stories and come up with a third, and to do so in relation to some of our European projects. Now, some of our African and Asian projects too, but what I'm saying, for instance, the exchanges between the Irish and British in Northern Ireland, for example, which has been a huge conflict zone, a 30-year war, etc., with thousands dead, that is of great interest to young people. I'm talking of pre-Gaza. Obviously, we haven't done anything since the recent outbreak of violence and tragedy. But it was of great interest to the Palestinian-Israeli conversation amongst young people, and vice versa. And Northern Irish people went to Jerusalem and back yet. And one of the ideas that a Palestinian and an Israeli came up with for a new story was this. They exchanged their stories, and they both realized, going back to their identity formation story, which is Abrahamic, that the favorite son of Abraham in Judaism is Isaac. The favorite son of Abraham in Islam, the Quran, is Ishmael. And so they're brothers, but they have different versions of who is the favorite son. And so there's a huge proximity there in terms of fraternity, but also a huge hostility, given the history. So what they did was, these contemporary young students, they exchanged roles, and one became Ishmael and wore the Jewish student, the Israeli student, wore chador and prayer shawl, etc. Whereas the Palestinian Arab, it was a Palestinian, the Palestinian Muslim wore the Star of David, and they walked together through the walls and the mosque. So that's a third story. It's an imaginary story, but what I'm saying is that I like to think that if we're working at solutions within Europe and values of overcoming conflict in Europe, and Northern Ireland was one of the last wars before Ukraine that was being fought in sort of the European landscape, it's transferable and translatable to other situations. And so that's kind of, how shall I put it, in addition to our need to empathize with Gaza for political and ethical reasons, there's also work that can be done at the level of narrative hospitality, where what's going on within Europe is also in many respects isomorphic to what's going on between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And sometimes it's when things get their very worst that there is a necessity to rethink and reimagine new solutions. And we don't have any at the moment, but there's a role for imagination there, what I call an utopian imagination, that revisits some of the old stories and tries to reconfigure them, giving a future to the past, as well as obviously a solution at the level of a military, economic, political solution. So that's just my last word on that. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Richard, for bringing back in the place of imagination all that. Did you have a final remark you'd like to make? No. Okay, so, and just to say, while all this has been going on, also online, there has been further debate happening, kind of, people have been writing and really questioning this thing of, well, is the European Union, does it have financial origins, or isn't it really about the vision and the dreams and the goals, those values that you were talking of, Lorna? And there's a kind of a debate around that. Is it really a viable entity at all? And there's a reference to Tim Marshall's work on prisoners of geography, just to bring that in for those of you that know that. So just to weave all of this in as well. So I think, and also just thinking back to Noel's opening around the myth of Europa, and it sounds like we're sort of also, Richard, what you've been bringing us is, do we need some new myths and some new stories that would really help us, guide us through the coming times. So with that, thank you so much, Hans Kundnani, Richard Kearney, Lorna Hayes. Thank you. Great. Let's take a seat. Okay, so it's interesting to be in this spot of knowing what's happening online, feeling the room here, being up on the stage, and kind of, I can feel, it's almost like I can hear you thinking. That this, so it's kind of, we call this a think tank, but it's quite something in a way to explore these ideas. And I know there's not a lot of space for us all gathered to engage directly in the conversation, but I hope it's sparking a lot of your own questions you're pursuing as we listen. So maybe if I could just invite almost a sort of a shift in mode. And also, as we heard, we started 15 minutes late, so I'd like to request 15 more minutes of your time to, if we'll end at 4:15, And I see some agreements happening between Noel and our hosts, so thank you so much. So with that, we'll have a little shift of mode and we'll go into the final section of the event and hear from colleagues here in the room in TU Dublin to really respond to what we've been hearing and maybe take that conversation a bit deeper. So if I could invite the panel up onto the stage. And yeah, if you maybe come. Yeah, so I'm going to, and yes, and if you do need to leave at a certain moment, please do. But it would be great to, given that we're all gathered, I think there's quite a lot more to explore. Give people a moment to do that. So. Well, warm welcome to our panel, and I'm going to maybe just to sort of keep it moving, but just to really to give a sense of wonderful esteemed colleagues that we have gathered with us. Professor Nitz Fitzpatrick probably doesn't exactly need an introduction as really our leader here opened the event, but perhaps if you don't know, just to say that Noel is the academic lead here in TU Dublin for the European University, a professor of philosophy and aesthetics. I didn't actually realise that a lot of your studies were originally in Paris, and yes. Realising now how your French is so blooming good. But yes, wonderful leader of all this work, so great to have a space here where you'll be sharing your thoughts, Noel. And then moving on, getting to meet new colleagues. So Dr. Deirdre McGowan. So Deirdre is head of law here in TU Dublin, solicitor, you have a PhD in law and sociology, and I understand that you're really looking at the connection between law, the connection law makes between politics and family practices, and you've written a book with your co-author on family law in context and also many other publications, so Deirdre, welcome. And then moving on to Catherine, Catherine Spencer. So you are the language studies lead here in TU Dublin, yeah, and I know you have a connection to the European University as well in the multilingualism office now, yeah. And maybe just to say, obviously all these colleagues, there's so many things we've all done in our careers, but your research area is in post-war Austrian identity and memory and learner identity. So I can see that really coming into these conversations as we're exploring our European values. So I will keep going on to welcome Catherine. Harry, nice to meet you, Harry. Senior lecturer in the School of Media here at TU Dublin, and also the co-founder and leader of our Centre for Critical Media Literacy, and author of a number of books, Hammered by the Irish, The Frontman and Public Sphere. I'm sorry I haven't read those, but they sound really, they draw me in. And you also have journalistic work that's been collected as well. So welcome to Harry, and welcome to all of you. And what our idea here is with the panel conversation, and just to really welcome you into this, is to invite our colleagues to first really just give an initial reaction, initial kind of statement to what we've just heard from Hans, from Richard, and from Lorna. What's your response? What's that bringing up? What's some extra perspectives we could bring in? And then we'll see in the time that we have how we can take that further. And maybe, yeah, sure. Turning to you, Noel.
So I suppose one of the things that struck me was that notion that Richard Kearney pointed to, which was the difference between the continent of Europe and the position of Ireland as an island off the coast of Europe, and the notion of the archipelago. And one of the things that came to mind was the notion of locality. So in our mission statement for the European University of Technology, we have specifically mentioned locality as something which is open-ended. So for me, what that points to is that in discourses which sometimes look to locality as something which is a closed space, so we could think of the notion of, the continent of Europe or Europe itself as an enclosure. We can also think of locality as something which is a condition of possibility of open-endedness. So the understanding of a distinction between the continent of Europe and the EU, or Europe and the EU, points to maybe a possibility of thinking of Europe as something which is much more a condition of possibility of being open. So that kind of links into what Richard Kearney pointed to in the notion of hospitality, that condition of possibility of openness is also maybe a condition of possibility of hospitality. So that's initial thoughts.
Thank you, thank you. We'll just keep going around on that same question. Yeah.
Okay, so what struck me was just, first of all, on this question of the EU as its foundation as an economic union, which of course it was, and I think, although Lorna did talk about, values going forward and the importance of EU values within the EU treaties now, but we shouldn't really lose sight of the fact that the EU continues to be foremost a European economic union, although they did drop economic from the name, but it is driven by a fundamental neoliberal growth imperative. And I don't think we can really, and a lot of the stuff in the treaties, if you have a look at them, is really about economics. And so I think we shouldn't get too swept up in the notion of, yes, of course the EU was set up to promote peace, but to promote peace within an economic framework. And so just to go on to that, the aims of the EU were initially, or are, to promote peace, its values and the well-being of its citizens. So then this brings me on to the EU values, and I suppose the EU values are in the EU treaties. There is a list of values in the EU treaties, so that means that they are a statement of law, if you like. And they are, things like human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, rule of law, and human rights. But just one thing to say about laws is we tend to have laws about things that have happened that we want to control some way how they happen in the future. So the reason that we're protecting human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, and rule of law is because we all have experience of not having those things. And so that's why we need, if we all respected everyone's dignity all the time, we wouldn't need a statement of a value that we respect people's dignity. So just again, to kind of be a little bit, I suppose, skeptical or cynical of, cynical, the right word, critical of this kind of notion that law is always in some way progressive, or that a statement of law or human rights is always progressive. And then also another thing I just wanted to focus on was this, again, the notion of human rights. So human rights, we have various human rights documents. We have them now integrated into EU law, but this is all still kind of transnational law. And they do reflect values. And values, you can agree with values and disagree with values. People have values, people have different values. There are conflicting values. If we all agreed on what the values were and what the human rights were, we wouldn't need the European Court of Human Rights. We wouldn't be here discussing whether the EU has breached its own values in its actions towards the Israel-Gaza conflict. So I think overall some really interesting contributions from the panels, and I very much liked Richard's idea of dialogue and this kind of memories and sharing of stories and how that can help us. And that's something that if you read a case about human rights before the European Court of Human Rights, that is often people with stories telling their stories, and then someone with a slightly different story, and then reaching some kind of accommodation, which is something that law is actually incredibly good at and useful for. We just have to be careful to recognize that often that is what law is good and useful for, and the sort of overarching statements can be not that helpful. And I think, as we've seen, laws are there to be broken, to be contested, to be pushed against. And I suppose what we can do as an EUT community is to keep that dialogue going, to make sure that where we're going is in a positive direction. That's it.
Thank you. Yeah, Catherine.
Yeah, I suppose listening to the speakers, I was thinking about European values and what they might mean in an educational context. And Hans talked about the fuzziness of kind of European values and how ill-defined they sometimes are, what they actually mean and who subscribes to them, I suppose. And I thought about, I suppose for me, I think a lot of the literature on the Erasmus program, for example, the same fuzziness applies, I suppose, to the notion of European identity. So it's often very ill-defined. Sometimes it's equated with an understanding, a better understanding of European institutions. Sometimes it's defined as a sense of being European or a feeling of being a part of Europe. And I think it's interesting, I suppose, the Erasmus project or the Erasmus program is considered one of the major success stories of Europe. When it started in 1987, there were about 3,000 higher education students who took part, and now it's about 300,000 per year. So I suppose just that, you know, so it's not quite clear what European identity means, but in a lot of the literature on the success of the Erasmus program, you know, it's listed as one of the many benefits, including employability and intercultural competence and things like that. So it just struck me as something that's as fuzzy, I suppose, as some of the European values that we might subscribe to. And I think then listening to Richard as well, when he talked about the guest book project and the idea of kind of participants in a dialogue creating a third story. I suppose on the flip side of that, the Erasmus program is lauded, I suppose, for its ability to bring students, participants together in very kind of direct contact, sharing stories, you know, experiencing each other's cultures and languages. So that's a kind of a very positive attribute, I suppose, of the Erasmus program, how it has enabled that kind of creation of a new story for many participants in that program.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I really enjoyed the presentations. I must say I particularly appreciated Lorna's enumeration in relation to migration and in relation to the Middle East of the failures of the EU in those regards. And one of the phrases that you used, Lorna, in relation to Europe tarnishing its reputation really stuck in my head. Okay, what's Europe's reputation? I was thinking, in the world outside Europe, among younger people, even within Europe, does Europe have a reputation to tarnish now? And it struck me, without being too caught up in the present, today in Brussels, the vote of the European Parliament, as Lorna mentioned, will essentially drive the final nail into the coffin of the humane migration and asylum policy for Europe. I had a text from a student, or former student, yesterday. She's in Brussels and she works in one of the European institutions. And she went to an event which was really striking. Francesca Albanese, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territories, was invited to speak to what was called a public hearing in the European Parliament building. Now, it was the first time, I think, that she had been brought in, even though she's Italian and she is the UN Special Rapporteur. As far as I understand it, it was the first time she'd been brought into one of the European institutions to speak, and it took members of the far left group in the European Parliament to do so, to bring her in to talk, and it was packed. There was a room could hold 150 people. They had to turn people away as people from around the parliamentary and commission and EU foreign service institutions came to hear her lay out the case in relation to genocidal actions by Israel, and also the complicity, not just the failure or the indifference, but the complicity, the direct participation, including through transfer of weaponry by European countries in that attack on civilians in Gaza. So it really struck me, and my former student texted, that these young people in particular working in European institutions, she said, seemed to be shell-shocked over the last few months by the behavior of the EU in regard to this. They used to believe the values stuff, she said. They used to believe the values stuff. And they don't anymore. Even those people working in those institutions, they don't believe the value stuff anymore. And I think the last kind of desperate roll of the dice in relation to maintaining some hold on the value stuff has been the construction of the far right as the European other, that thing that is not really, doesn't truly reflect European values and that we'll combat. So there was a headline in The Guardian in February saying, Ursula von der Leyen vows not to work with the far right. But there was a headline in Politico on the very same day saying, Ursula von der Leyen says she is open to working with the far right. And actually, it was the second headline that was true. The first headline was a propaganda construction. The second headline was correct. Ursula von der Leyen would work with the far right as long as they were the far right who was supportive of NATO. So Giorgia Meloni is out there on behalf of Europe negotiating the treaty with Egypt that will extend the search and destroy missions that to prevent migration into the European Union, essentially the outsourcing of the killing of migrants to North African regimes. So the far right is right in there enacting European values, and European values are exclusion, European values are colonialism, European values are war and militarization, European values are all of those things. And the truth is that the European Union and Europe don't have a reputation to tarnish.
Just taking a moment to let that sink in, and all the contributions of colleagues, because I'm actually thinking, in a way, we have a question here. You know, our question is, well, the broad question is what European values, and like we're hearing, well, the young people, they don't believe the value stuff anymore. But it's complex, because there seems to be different kinds of values, and then at times we seem to be living up to them or implementing them, and at times we don't. So, and this is the question we wanted to get into. So just, I mean, it was great to hear the sort of passion with which you spoke, Harry, and then also, Catherine, I was thinking of the Erasmus program has come up a number of times. That was, I think of myself as a young person, I was at high school in Scotland, and that, you know, we met the Erasmus program as we started to exit high school, and that was in a way my entry into being European, you know, it probably really was. And then what you were saying, Deirdre, of actually, well, rules are there to be butted up against. That's, you know, it's okay that well, it's not okay, but it's okay and it's not okay that we're breaking them, that we're that's part of the function. It's not all going to be perfect and that we meet them. And I think from the philosophical perspective, it's this, and we're getting that from Richard, and I feel from you, Noel, there's a more open, we need to keep opening things in the way we understand them to maybe have a hope of being able to embrace them in any kind of wholeness. So I don't quite know how to pose the question, but it is something around, well, how come we're not doing what some of us think we're saying we're doing? Or there appear to be some European values that are proclaimed and we're not living up to those, or maybe we could challenge it and say, well, no, there aren't. There's actually these other European values. But can we expand a bit more on, either we don't know what European values are, or there's an idea of what they are, but that is being violated, or that is being broken. And why is that? You know, why don't we just have one set of values that everybody knows and we're actually living up to them? So could each of our speakers expand on that a bit?
I think that maybe it was what I was trying to say in the opening few sentences was that these, in one way, these are open to interpretation. Right. That's a kind of facile response to say, you know, we need to unpack them, appropriate them, interpret them. But I think at the same time, I would take the challenge of what Harry said, is that sometimes these are given as aspirational values. So we have the Treaty of Lisbon. We have certain documents that we can point to and say, you know, this is what all of the governments have signed up to as a group of values. Okay, but I think the difficulty is that that is an aspiration rather than something which is being implemented. And I think there's a kind of, I was thinking, even there's a German philosopher, Peter Sloterdijk, who talks about cynical reason. You know, so we say one thing, but we do something else. You know, I think that's part of the challenge that we're facing in relation to Palestine and Gaza, is that this is really an affront, a direct affront of what those aspirational values are. And yet we haven't been able to get a consistent and coherent response to that. I think that's part of the contradiction. So to answer the question, maybe these are aspirations and the difficulty is the implementation.
Other remarks?
I mean, I suppose that I found this question quite difficult because values are always contested and you always have to ask whose values. You know, the notion of there being European values, I suppose I find a little problematic in itself because Europe is a very big place and the EU kind of states that it has values and it calls them values. But that's a massive organisation, it's not monolithic, and like you say, there may be young people in there who are very driven by this value-based system, but there are also lots of technocrats and bureaucrats. You know, there's a European Central Bank. You know, there's lots of different pieces to it, and I suppose maybe because we're coming from a particular perspective, we're looking for the set of European values that we can adhere to. But you know, even things that we might ostensibly agree on across Europe in, so for example, the human rights statements, I mean, they're deeply contested. There are lots of people who don't agree with the types of ruling that are coming out of the European courts around human rights. So I think this notion of trying to expect that there are European values and that these are positive, I find that a little bit problematic, to be honest. And I think that there may be other ways that we need to think about sort of coming together as a community to work for better lives for everyone, that maybe go beyond this notion of sort of legalistic type values and norms.
Thank you. Yeah. Other reflections?
I mean, I think, you know, it might be helpful to think about what Europe is in the modern world, you know, and how Europe is constituted over recent centuries. And it is essentially constituted as that part of the world that got rich on the labor and resources of the rest of the world, you know, and then obviously some of its settler colonies similarly. So, and if we understand it in those terms as the part of the world with the luxury of reflecting on its aspirations while it lives on the blood and toil of the others, then we can possibly see these aspirations as a certain kind of a facade, you know, as a kind of a signal of the civilizing mission and of the you know, of somehow deserving the status that the history of capitalism has conferred on this small region of this non-continent in Western Europe.
I'm just thinking of where to, I'm going to take this one more place which we had sort of considered for this conversation, and then if those of you who are still with us, have energy with us, it might be good to hear a few other voices as well. But I was just thinking, you know, what does this mean for us then in a technological university? You know, what does it mean for us in education and university, and here technological university in Dublin, and the European University, of course. So these values, whether they are contested or there's good aspirations, there's complicity, how do we act that out in good ways in the education we're aiming to provide and develop, and the innovation we're trying to foster with our young people?
Maybe I'll just continue from what Harry has just said. I think there's kind of one of the ways, I suppose we've all accepted now that we have a need for biodiversity. And one of the arguments we could argue is that we need a form of techno-diversity. We've had a form of taking value, extracting in a particular way, and I'm going to continue with that maybe colonial metaphor of taking resources from somewhere else. So what we've had is, you could argue, a form of technological extractivism which even goes down to our neurological attention spans now, where we are constantly called upon to attend in a particular way because of a particular form of model of using digital technologies, which is based on a very old model of advertising, basically. That's the model. So we've had a form of technological development which is always in that mode of extracting. Okay? So we could argue that within a technological university, perhaps our role is to think of a form of techno-diversity, which is other forms of technologies, which could be, you know, we could think of things of other forms of social media which are more about social justice. You know, I'm thinking out loud, but that's what I mean. So perhaps the role within a technological university is actually to see, even if they are aspirational values, that value system itself could actually lead to other forms of technological innovation and other forms of technology.
Well, I think it's interesting that, you know, digital capitalism mostly has its major centers in North America and in China. Europe does have an opportunity to actually give voice to some of those values, and to a certain extent it could be argued that it has done so in the likes of the GDPR, for example, where I mean, those companies, we cannot say that they lack influence in Brussels, but we can say that they're to a certain extent, they're non-native here, and that Europe has an opportunity for a certain kind of resistance culture, potentially in relation to that particular form of mental extractivism, mental and physical extractivism, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Just to bring in one thing from our colleagues online, it's really, there's a rich conversation happening written, but I think it was based on your earlier point, Harry, of, you know, well, is there any country that, you know, there are many other countries that have the same issue of, you know, its reputation is tarnished. You know, what about America? What about China? You know, it's not just us in Europe. But yeah, and also just to say, we like Deirdre keeping it real. That was a good one. And there's, you know, lots of other positive remarks, and just thank you for connecting into the conversation with us all. Anything else on that? I was just thinking, you know, it's just kind of bringing this, we're having the high level conversation, but then coming to this notion of what that means for us as educators. I don't know, anything else for you, Catherine? I was just sort of struck by, like with the Erasmus thing, for example, but, you know, our educational programs and how we are trying to take the values and enact them on the ground level with our young people. But yes, I don't know, there's other reflections for you in your teaching work.
Maybe in the field of language education and language policy, collaboration, I suppose, at institutional level has led to the introduction of the Common European Framework of Reference for Language Education, which has done a huge amount, really, I suppose, on the ground for educators, for students, in terms of identifying a framework, you know, with which educators, students can identify, they can see different kind of proficiency levels. So it has really mapped out a shared image or a shared picture, I suppose, of what language learning, language competence could be or might be in Europe. So that's a kind of a positive outcome, possibly, that's felt on the ground and in education. You know, it has led, I suppose, to greater recognition as well in universities and educational settings and in the wider community of what language, you know, what the different proficiency levels are and what they mean in real contexts. So there's a kind of a bottom-up and a top-down kind of perspective that I think has been positive.
Yeah, thank you. And Deirdre, anything for you just on this, bringing it back into the university in a sense?
Well, I suppose the Erasmus programme, I do feel, is one huge bonus that the EU has brought to education. I mean, it is absolutely massive, and it really is transformational in terms of people understanding other cultures and other countries, because although we tend to think of Europe as kind of quite homogenous, you know, it's really not, and it's really, you know, even places we go to a lot, like Spain, you know, it's just over there, and we all go there all the time, but it's a very different country. You know, and they have a very different colonial history, and, you know, there's lots of different stuff going on there, and all the different languages, and, you know, it's really good that Irish people, for instance, Irish students can go there and appreciate that, and that there are different ways of looking at things and different ways of thinking about things and different ways of living. And I think also one thing, I suppose, that one value that we're going to have to come up against very soon is this value of surviving as we go into this sort of world of global warming. And it's interesting we kind of think in Ireland as kind of a green and pleasant land with lots of space, but, you know, we're not really. And then when you go to other countries and you see different ways that they have of living lives and doing things, and seeing just how complex that is going to be, and that might be something that in universities are an obvious place to start that movement towards thinking about how do we collectively, because it has to be collectively, you know, come up with some kind of ethic for survival into the future.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So just a note on where we are. We've just passed our 4:15 mark, but it'd be lovely to hear a few questions. What do you think, Noel? Yes, okay, John. So let's, just to say, afterwards there's coffee, but if I personally am really enjoying this conversation, so I think we'll go on just for another 15 minutes. So, John O'Connor.
Thanks, Ali. John O'Connor, I'm the strategic lead for the EUT Plus here at TU Dublin, and kind of as the sponsor of this debate today. Firstly, I want to thank everybody who's been involved. It was absolutely fascinating. It's also been very difficult. It's been very difficult to listen to this, and I'm conflicted. But I just wanted to make one or two observations. One thing that is absolutely and utterly unique about the point we are at today is that we are facing a global challenge. The world has never humanity has never faced that before. We have absolutely and utterly no idea on how to deal with it, and we're bringing all of the old thought processes and thinking and approaches to it. I'm very taken with Noel's approach to the description of technology as our way of intervening in our environment. And I think it's really important, this broad view of technology. And we are in a university of technology, and we are trying to build a new European university of technology. For me, the hope is that in trying to introduce young people to the realities of the global threat that we're facing, and the fact is, and I'm picking up on what people have said, that the only solution to this is collective, and we mean planetary collective. But we also know from history that the haves have never willingly given up what they have to the have-nots. And yet, one of the things that's coming to me is that the greatest resource that we are ignoring on this planet is the resource of the minds and the brains and the people that exist in this planet. And for a large part, we ignore the Global South. We don't give the Global South an opportunity to come into the conversation, never mind to become part of the solution. And until we can find a way to do that and really begin to respond globally, we aren't going to get a solution. And the race for me now is whether or not that sense can prevail globally before we destroy ourselves. And that's the race that we're facing at the moment. But we, to bring it back to reality and everyday responsibility and what we can do about it, is in our university. That's the kind of message that we need to try and promulgate, not just with our students, but with our colleagues and with the societies we live in.
And actually just thinking, rather than maybe just in the interest of time, that was a powerful statement, maybe just to open it up. Any other remarks? We'll hear, a few different remarks. We have our mic assistant just up in the back. It's right up at the back.
It's good. I have thank you. I have one.
You have
That's
one.
Good.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Very organized. So over to you.
Yes, hello there. So thanks very comments and discussion. Like going back into the role of universities. So I have a question here about, universities are forming people to sort of adapt and perpetuate an economic system and a social system that's very particular, that has very particular values. Now, like facing all the environmental, social, economic crisis that we are having, like reflecting on those values, how do we prepare students not to perpetuate the system that has kind of given us the results that we know and that we're suffering from, but to transform that society? So, like going back into education would be nice to have some leads on how do we do that? How do we evaluate those capacities, not of adaptation to a labor system, but to transformation of something into something that we don't really know what it looks like. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So just hold that and we'll hear Jai as well. Yeah.
Is that, oh my God. Okay. Just to slightly pick up on what John was saying there and maybe bring two different ideas together as well. It kind of, what you were saying reminds me a lot of the Audre Lorde quote, right? That you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. But it also reminds me of Eduardo Viveiros de Castro's, his ending of the book, The End of Worlds, where he argues that if you were an indigenous Brazilian living several hundred years ago, you've already lived the apocalypse. We're witnessing a specific apocalypse for a specific set of society's tools and dominant epistemologies in this particular moment. So I kind of wonder if, coming back to maybe something that Noel mentioned there, is there space within the EUT and within contemporary academic and educational discourse to start defining a value as being porosity, right? To take the need for social justice as a redistribution of the institutional power that the EU has in almost an exchange or a discourse or a dialogue with maybe some of the epistemological frameworks and tools that might be found outside of it, as a way of not only just redistributing but forging new methods to deal with, you know, all of the different global catastrophes, as you said, John, that we're facing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And if so, how do we do that in a way which is not extractivist, which isn't simply plucking something from the global south and saying, "Oh, we'll take that now." You know, how do we create ethical approaches towards developing survival ethics, as was said previously? Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Wow, so a lot there, and I like that word you used there, Jai, the porosity. This question of how can we work with this as a university? I'm going to bring in one other thing, which is sort of different in a way, but I think it's important to be there. So this is with our online colleagues. Also, you know, what do we all think of, or what does Ireland think, in fact, of European values grounded in Christian values? Because this is actually currently at the centre of discussions on Europe and Italy. So I know we're going all over the territory, but it's all a part of it, isn't it? Like you were saying, Jojo, I mean, Europe is a very big, multiple, diverse thing. And we heard earlier about this kind of I just cannot say that word, plurality of stories. And then the law kind of backs it up, but there's something around this multipleness. So maybe just inviting the panel, this would be a chance for maybe a kind of final remark, riffing off all of these threads that have been coming up as we come to a close.
Lot. Yeah. So maybe just I was trying to think, one of the things I was thinking about is the role of the university for a second. So at the beginning I referenced the text from Jack Derrida, which is actually a very, very controversial text, and there's quite a lot in it. But what he argues for is a university without conditions. And what he means by that is that sometimes there seems to be a correlation between an economic imperative and higher education. That's one condition. And also there is a kind of a form of development of innovation that tends to be linked to universities also. So Derrida made that speech in Stanford in 1998, and what he was arguing for was for the value of the arts and humanities within university. That's what the text is about. But one of the things I like about the text is it's a challenge, because what he says is that the university cannot be without conditions because of the way the world works and how we're structured and how we're financed, as we know, in TU Dublin at the minute. So it's like there are certain conditions to what we can do. But the challenge, and I'm going to take up the question from Santi, is that, you know, the challenge is that the university has to have a role within that to push, to say, leave us without conditions. What can we do without these conditions? And I think the role, I would say, of the European University of Technology is in fact that kind of challenging of those different stories. And I'm just picking up what you said, Deirdre. What I found really fascinating was that when I go to Bulgaria or when I go to Latvia, what I uncover, in fact, is histories and stories that I know very little about. Conflicts, tensions within different communities that I just, in our positionality on the west coast of Europe, have not really learned about. So that's one of the challenges, and I think one of the fascinating aspects of the European University of Technology is just enabling us as a group to share those stories over time and to get to know each other. And that's part of, maybe going back to Richard's comment, that is that migration, that's that narrative voice that has to take place through. This is an Erasmus Plus project. So this project of the European University Alliances is actually funded within that framework of Erasmus. Then to John's question, I think, you know, even though last week we had a group of geologists who have now contested the use of the term Anthropocene, you know, So it's kind of, I'm going to leave that aside for a second. We have, because it's a term I use all the time, sorry, but it's like, so we now have a global challenge, which is something which is beyond the Irish nation state, Europe, but it's a kind of planetary issue. And on the 20th of January 2020, with a group of people, we had a manifesto where we went to the UN, okay? And what we proposed was the notion of the internation. So the internation goes back to the League of Nations of Marcel Mauss of 1920. He wrote this text. And what he argues for is that in order to be able to deal with these complex problems which are beyond the nation state, what we need to do is come up with a form of internation. And it's only at that level of the internation that we can really pose these questions of climate change. And I think it's becoming more and more an imperative that we're able to do that. And on a very concrete level, within the university, one of the things that we've worked on in the Erasmus strategic partnership projects we've had is to look at the question of ethics and technological education. So can we ask questions about ethics, ecology, and technological education? What does that mean? What does that mean in terms of the curriculum? What does it mean in terms of how we teach? So at a very concrete level, I think that's how we can intervene. I think I've said too much. Yeah.
Yeah. No, there is just so much there. And maybe just to say to other colleagues, it's not that we have to have answers to all of this. I really appreciate hearing the voices from all of us gathered. And maybe it's just any final remarks as we close is really to conclude the conversation. So
I get to bring in some of the research I actually did before this. So I had a look at the European Values Study, which has actually European countries much broader than the EU. It doesn't include Ireland because we don't have the mechanisms to collect the information. But just that question about Italy and Christianity, one of the questions on that is being Christian, having European culture and European ancestors important to being European? And I don't think there were any country where yes was below 50%. So I think we can't, in terms of you're talking about European values, as in what people actually think, we can't really discount that, okay? And there was another question of belief in God, which was similarly high levels. So really worth having a look at if anybody's interested in European values. And then just very briefly in terms of what the university can do in relation to sort of the climate emergency. The one thing I would say on that is that we have to be very careful. Young people know very, very well the mess that we're in. They also know who caused it. So I think we have to be very careful on that one, particularly for us slightly older people. Because this change has accelerated maybe in the last 20 years. So I think what we can do, and go back to this notion of sort of this liberal education, or this education in how to think and this learning to learn, what we owe to our young people is to teach them the value of education, the value of learning, the value of problem solving, so that they can take it and do what needs to be done, because we don't know what needs to be done. And really, in fairness, we caused the problem.
Thank you. Moving on, any final remarks?
Maybe just to go back to what one or two of my colleagues have mentioned in relation to, the very many contested memories and stories and values, I suppose, across Europe. We also have a very kind of diverse kind of linguistic landscape in Europe, so 24 official languages in the EU, but about 200 languages spoken across Europe. And I suppose maybe take heart from that maybe, and see scope for unity in that diversity, or at least kind of functionality in that diversity, I suppose.
It's certainly not mono, is it?
No. There's nothing mono about it.
It's complex, but we have a richness. Thank you, Catherine. Harry.
It has been very rich, and we've been here a long time, so
yes.
Very, very brief. Deirdre, I think, has answered the question about Christianity very well. I just say that there is a rich literature about the way that the European version of secularity is a kind of a thin layer of paint over a kind of a Christian tradition, and I think that's worth exploring, but I won't do it here now. The other thing, I guess, is about the Global South, and I appreciate John's input on that, and indeed other people that were bringing in that aspect of it. I don't have the quote in front of me, but I think that Frans Fanon said that Europe is essentially a constitution of the Third World, that the Third World created Europe. And I think that I was making a similar point myself earlier, and I think that understanding of Europe unbounded, as Noel said, I think back at the beginning of this session many days ago, and the end of the university, similarly unbounded, without conditions, is something that we need to take into our hearts, into our minds, and into our action if we can begin to turn this kind of discussion about values into a discussion about, really action that serves humanity and doesn't just serve an idea of Europe.
So thank you so much. Thank you to our incredible panel, Harry Brown, Catherine Spencer, Deirdre McGowan, Noel Fitzpatrick, and to all of you and really the chance to kind of conclude the think tank today with this conversation. So first, thanks to the panel. Thank you so much. We may be breaking European records for going over half an hour over our allotted time. So we're coming to a close. Just to check, will we have some closing remarks?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I wanted to thank a few people. So I wanted to thank, we had an ad hoc committee that put this together. So we had Kevin, Deirdre, Sylvia, John were involved, and in particular Paul, because Paul has put in a lot of work in terms of the organisation. Yeah, thank you. That's it.
Okay, well, so that is it. Is there coffee?
There's coffee outside, yeah.
So thanks so much, everyone. Goodbye.